Start recording. Greetings, welcome to the final Transforming Assessment webinar for 2023. Hopefully we'll be back in 2024 if somebody gives me a job. Okay, today's speaker is Kane Murdoch from Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. And the topic is Courageous Conversations Addressing Integrity Issues with Humanity. So Kane, would you like to begin, please?
Thanks, Matthew. Thanks for the invite to speak, and thanks everyone for coming along. So my name is Kane. I am the head of complaints, appeals and misconduct for a large public university in Sydney, Australia. As the kind of title suggests, misconduct is a large part of my job, and it's what I consider to be like 2/3 of my job, to be perfectly honest. I have a background in investigating contract cheating and have been very successful in that. And when you start to do these things, like dealing with serious misconduct at something approaching the kind of scale that it's actually occurring, what dawns on you is that the processes that are typically employed by institutions to deal with it are not really fit for purpose for a range of reasons. And I hope I'll explain those during this talk. Before we kind of go any further, like, what are courageous conversations? Let's not get ahead of ourselves. A courageous conversation, it's an institutional process for responding to misconduct, but it's one that aims to be more effective than what it succeeded, and also to engage with students. We talk about education and educative actions, but I don't see a lot of evidence that these things happen, and even where they do, they're not very effective in my view. So we're aiming for effectiveness and not kind of performative bastardry. I would also just like to note that I didn't come up with this solely. I came up with it with a former colleague named David House, and we were at the time working for UNSW in Sydney, a different university. And I'd also like to note that they were forward thinking enough to embrace courageous conversations, mainly because they had to, because of the scale at which we were finding misconduct. So here's a kind of introductory quote. It's how I kind of like to think about misconduct. People often kind of frame it in it's a moral collapse, or they might want to frame it that the neoliberal university with its dastardly wiles has made cheating happen. I think both of those things are fundamentally untrue. I prefer to think that students are adults and they make choices, and sometimes those choices are poor. So as I said, like a kind of refresher course in what happens when you make mistakes. Oh, that is loading. So the other thing to note in this space is that integrity, misconduct, whatever you want to call this space, the people who act in this space quite often kind of take up that punisher role. And the alternative is that people kind of wave everything through. There's, in a sense, no consequences, or there's too high consequences, unreasonable or disproportional consequences. So I wanted to remind everyone in this space, and it's something that I keep in mind, keep very front of mind, that we're supposed to be part of education, and I do consider myself an educator in this sense, and it's something worth keeping it very much in mind. These slides are a little slow, sorry. So I wanted to move on to where actual serious stuff happens, like plagiarism, copy and paste plagiarism, to an extent where students are colluding. These are all minor breaches. These are, on the objective scale of seriousness, they are minor breaches. However, the ways that universities handle them are as if they're very serious breaches, and sometimes the penalties reflect that belief. And so I wanted to let you know that I only deal with serious stuff. I don't deal with copy and paste plagiarism. I haven't dealt with a minor collusion case in about 2.5 years. I deal primarily with what people in the university like to call fraud, but I call falsified documentation, say for medical certificates and that type of thing, serious behavioral concerns up to including sexual assault, and serious virtual program level contract cheating. And just to give you a picture of what that looks like, this is on the right hand side a image which we produce using our software that we've created called Wiroo. Each blue dot is a student in a particular subject. The lines are shared IP addresses between those students. And at the core of that kind of hub there is students who are sharing IP addresses with many, many other students. So when I talk about the scale and the seriousness, that's kind of what I'm talking about. But when we think about misconduct, we think about student codes, we think about a rule or a set of rules that students have to follow. And then when they don't follow those rules, like this, you know, that's a kind of almost silly or childish form of cheating, but, you know, we all recognize what it is. And then we kind of bring down the hammer and we can feel perfectly justified in doing that. The question is whether it's actually effective. These are our students. These are people, and we're supposed to care about them. Instead, in my experience, most university misconduct processes make them feel more like this. And I've heard this phrase used a great deal: that will give them a scare. To me, it's a deeply unhelpful kind of way of thinking about the problem that we're facing. And it's a non-solution. The idea that you need to actually scare students to dissuade them from acting inappropriately, to my mind, is not correct. I think students need to know that the risks they are running are higher than they think, and therefore they will make a kind of calculation between the risks involved and the reward involved. And students have literally said this to me over and over again. When I ask, why did you do this thing? They will tell me, I weighed up the risk, I weighed up the reward, and I made my decision. So when we kind of wonder, besides those things, what's the actual problem with the way we handle misconduct? And to my mind, the actual problem is that in the first case, we're putting staff into an adversarial position with their students. And I consider the entire student body to be your students for any academic room. So we're putting them into a adversarial position, very often into a position that many of them are, or many of you are not comfortable with. And as with anything, if you're not comfortable being in that position, if you're not comfortable with the ways, the methods that things are handled, you will probably not do the job in a particularly effective way. Most academics, I'd imagine, I'm sure there are outliers who prefer to be the punisher, but I'd imagine that most academics would prefer to feel like this guy. And it was just the image that I got. Apologies for any gender bias on this one. At least I made the punisher a man as well. You know, so academics would much prefer to be in this kind of position. And in part, that's where I come in, because I take a bit of that. I take a bit of that adversarial sense, but I'm also trying to dissipate the adversarial sense. And another problem with these processes is that they're usually very, very slow. And as I say, when we're talking about the lower hanging fruit, copy and paste plagiarism, things that are, you know, for Turnitin for all its failings, kind of does what it says on the tin. It says, we're going to identify where there's shared material between this submission and others and the internet. And we kind of make a big mountain out of a molehill with regard to copy and paste plagiarism, which in my view isn't cheating. In light of students' knowledge that Turnitin exists, basically they'd be pretty stupid to deliberately go ahead. So it begs the question, why would they do it? I think you would find that most often they have time pressures. They've managed their time very poorly. They had some life circumstance that led them to do this, or they quite simply, and this one's closer to cheating, they thought they were going to fail and they didn't want to, which is understandable, but it's still not serious. So we make a mountain out of a molehill with regard to the small stuff, and it takes a long time because it's an adversarial process. So when we put students on the other side of that process, they will tend to be defensive. They will tend to deny, deflect. They won't really see what you're saying or necessarily see the credibility, the evidence you're putting in front of them, in part because of the way we're putting it in front of them. So it takes more time, costs us more resources. As I said, the costs are very high when we have really drawn out bureaucratic processes. And what that means is it's not just money. It can be staffing. It can be your time. If you are academic integrity officer or something like this, it can be your time and what could you be otherwise doing. It can be the emotional cost, the emotional effective cost of doing this work. You may require more staff to do this, i.e. you may require more staff to manage the administration because the matter got bigger than it needed to be. And I've also noticed that when we put students in that position, so they receive a very stern letter from the university and it kind of hand waves at terrible punishments being rained down on them, they will tend to seek support from well-being, from advocacy services. And by the by, we front-end load that, and I'll talk to that shortly. So we very much front-end load and encourage them to access these services. The question is, how often do they feel the need to access them? And the question in my head is, what do we actually gain from doing it that way? And I struggle to come up with a good answer. I don't honestly kind of have a very good idea about what we're gaining. I think it's just handed down from time immemorial and it's the way we treat cheating. Personally, while I think it should be fairly obvious that I'm not a kind of punitive hardliner, I find some other statements that, we should ignore cheating to be kind of contemptible and destructive of education. So what that really means is we need to kind of find and explore nuance, and we can't really do that in a highly adversarial process. We get to understand student choices better when they're telling us honestly what their choices were. So I'm making the argument that we need to transition to a different model. I think it's better, but leave that open to everyone else's experience. And you start to kind of think, how does this happen? In universities, it can be a sense of immovable objects and we can't make things happen. I would ask you individually or collectively, if there's more of you from one institution, to go and have a look at what amounts to your plagiarism procedure, your misconduct procedure, these types of documents, and to look at how specific and instructive they are. For example, how often the word will appears in these documents is actually a very important point because it instructs that certain things must happen versus a word like may, which is a very different word. It involves choice, it involves discretion. And where we dictate that a certain person or a certain group must do things, we can start asking why they are the best person to do this. So courageous conversations isn't something that's kind of up in the air. Like, obviously every institution is more than welcome to take what they will from this. Once we actually started thinking about it, we did see principles in what we were doing, and I'll briefly talk you through these. So we want this to be, in as much as we possibly can, an educative process. And I think it's reasonable to say that when we don't have a conversation with a student, when it's a purely adversarial process, we're instructing the student, we're telling them, we're kind of creating a veneer of fairness, that the opportunities for us to educate are virtually nil, and also the likelihood of them taking on that education is also virtually nil. So I would ask you to consider whether you think that students learn from misconduct processes. It's been my observation, especially in serious stuff, that most universities have, or many universities have, a kind of misconduct panel. But another way to think about that panel is as a star chamber. And you start asking yourself, how do students feel about that? And I also did a calculation for a university, and I calculated that their misconduct panel was costing them about $7,000 a meeting based on the seniority of the people involved and the levels of administrative support, minute taking, that type of thing required. It's frankly not a good spend. We wanted to focus less on the breach. The fact that we believe a breach may have happened, or we have concerns around a breach occurring, we have to be able to separate that from the person who did it, or the person who we believe to have done it. So to kind of paint that picture a little bit more, I think there's a feeling that once students cross a line, i.e. are believed to have breached your code, your policy, your whatever, that they become a cheat. I tend to think of cheating as a verb rather than cheat as a person. I don't think that's a very useful framing. I think it's helpful to remind ourselves that this is a often inexperienced person, a person whose life is more complex than we have any visibility of. And at heart, they are still a person, and we want to keep them as part of our learning community. And when we focus only on what they did, we kind of fail to do that. Partnership, this is a very useful kind of aspect that I've found on multiple occasions, that academics become partners in seeking information from students. So when we're not leaping in two-footed, to use a kind of soccer analogy, approaching a potential breach with a bit more delicacy. Ooh, Matthew, I've just noticed that chat. Is an educative approach being soft and sending a signal that they will get off lightly if they take the risk to cheat? I will also add that I do consider myself a professional courier of consequences, to hark back to that quote at the start. There is most certainly consequences for doing these things. The question is, are those consequences appropriate? Are they proportionate to the thing that's happened? For example, if someone is failing a student in a subject for copy and paste plagiarism, I tend to think that's extremely disproportionate, for example. But I do understand when the idea is that it's an only educative response, that would be soft in my view. So yes, I agree if it's only that. It's when it comes with consequences as well that I think it's reasonable. But to come back to the partnership thing, oftentimes, like, I'm a professional investigator, and I lead a team of investigators. But there's, as everyone here knows, a subject matter expert on quantum mechanics. I am most certainly not. I can't read maths, for example. Like, I can read plagiarism in a English text document versus another source, but I can't necessarily tell code, plagiarized code, for example, where any computer scientist would almost certainly be able to do that. And so to bring them in to be able to ask questions based in their educative strengths, rather than, and I handle the sense that this might be a breach, and they're handling the sense in which they want to understand more about what happened with their kind of academic hat on rather than their punisher hat on. So it becomes a more useful approach, but also a better way of gathering evidence in conjunction with the student. We don't have to present it as a misconduct matter in that sense. We can write to a student and talk about, we have concerns about your work in ABC assessment, and we would like to discuss them with you. That becomes a much more interactive, a much more soft touch approach to getting information from a student about what did or didn't happen. University misconduct processes, I think they're seen to be fair because someone's following a procedure or a policy, but I question whether they are genuinely fair. The power dynamics involved are so disproportionate, so, one side is vastly more powerful than the other. And the student, I have no doubt, could feel completely, I'm not sure what the word I'm looking for, but, kind of crushed by that. Where having me across the table, and as nice as I might sound here, I am very significantly nicer in those meetings. I think that gives a different sense of what is fair. And I'm not trying to gotcha a student. I'm not trying to bully them into an admission. I am not fishing. If I don't have enough information to support a concern in the first place, that is, with no further information, if I couldn't prove it, I wouldn't action it. So I need to have fairly hard evidence that something has happened before I take these steps. And this process allows us to present to the student in a very different way than a typical misconduct process. So we want to not only be fair, but be seen to be fair. We have taken some data anonymized from students, just asking for their impressions of that process. And some students disagreed that it was fair. And when we correlated that with their outcomes, that was generally the correlation, i.e. the more serious it became, the less fair they thought it was, in large part because some of these students were losing significant amounts of their transcript. However, in more simple matters, there was almost 100% agreement that it was fairness. On the more serious matters, I would note that the evidence we have is extensive and objective. So I don't actually agree that it was unfair, but I understand why they might think it was unfair. Efficiency is a really important part of this. As I said, when we're spending a lot of time dealing with simple matters or less important matters, like whether a student plagiarized a paragraph out of Wikipedia and put it into an essay, is quite simply, objectively, not as serious as someone contract cheating multiple subjects in their program. And what we start to find is that once your detection improves, you actually need to have more effective, more efficient processes, because otherwise you basically have a massive backlog which grows. We have a significant number of cases, and it is simply not possible that we could deal with these in the next decade were it not for courageous conversations. And just to put some figures on that, I implemented courageous conversations at Macquarie in end of last year, and in the cases in the time since, it's about a year for a major public university. You can kind of guess at the caseload. The time taken to resolve the cases has been cut by 2/3, more than 2/3. And for anyone that does wish to look at some public data on this, the UNSW Conduct and Integrity Office, of which I was formerly the head of the Student Conduct Unit, has a published annual report. And I think it was 2020 or 2021, they gave some more detailed data around how much more efficient these processes were. Amy Milker, my concern is the high threshold of evidence required in these more serious cases. Often it is extremely hard to substantiate these concerns. Does courageous conversations reduce the burden of evidence? Not in the most serious cases, Amy, but certainly in less serious cases. Because when we put it to a student and they agree that this thing happened, we don't need to take other investigative avenues to find more evidence that something did or didn't happen. By the by, as I mentioned, we use software that we created called Wiru, and we're able to produce a 40-page report on contract cheating in less than 2 days, which is then sent to the student for further comments. Mike, aren't we ignoring the AI elephant in the HE room, which has blown an enormous hole in existing HE academic approaches? I'm not seeing any reduction in contract cheating, Mike. I suspect that's in large part because students don't have confidence with generative AI. And I've consistently and publicly argued for a major shift to programmatic assessment, which de-emphasizes the role of individual subject coordinators. Happy to talk about that afterwards. So policies, as I said, people tend to think this is just this monster and we can't ever do anything. I'd ask you to go and take a look at your policies and to see whether they have anything that it would be called something like an assessment phase, and it'd perhaps have a range of options available within that before a formal investigation. And in our procedure, it basically says that it says there will be an assessment phase and people in my unit can do one of several things, one of which is an informal resolution. It doesn't have to be specifically labeled in your procedure. And if you have something like that, it's entirely possible that you could use that clause to be able to, procedurally correctly create courageous conversations around that. The other thing that is really worth noting is that courageous conversations needs a flattened decision-making structure. So if every decision requires, say, an associate dean or a professor or a senior academic of some sort to agree to the decision to be involved in the evidence gathering or the conversation itself, that's effectively adding time and cost to the process. I would say that you need proportional decision making. So if it's a very, very serious matter, by all means, bring in your university panel. My team write reports and we reach findings of fact, and the panel effectively decide whether they accept those findings of fact, which include the student's response in the report, and then they decide what the outcome, what the university's response is going to be. To break up this rather than having it land on one person's desk at quite a senior level is actually highly important. So you can absolutely have professional staff doing these conversations. You just do not need academics involved where a student admits to something. As long as those professional staff are appropriately trained and supervised and there's a proper structure. So to kind of bring it to a little more specifics, I'm going to give you the kind of brief view of what the step-by-step is. So as I said, an assessment, a triage, whatever you want to think about it, once a report is received, and by the by, my team create our, and I'm going to use the word create advisedly, we detect our own contract cheating cases. We effectively don't require academics to send us anything in that respect, but in plenty of other ways we do. So to have that triage assessment phase, we can consider, if I receive no further information, is there a prima facie breach of university policy? And the things to consider, is it in the scope of the university's activities? What is the actual breach? You'll surprisingly often find that students have done things and it's simply not considered under your policies. Generative AI, classic example. No one, or very, very few, none to my knowledge, actually, no universities actually had generative AI in their policies until it blew up. And then they quickly scrambled to get it. You're better off having broader principle-based policies with examples, so students can be reasonably clear about what is okay and what is not, but which allow for some description. And do you have evidence to support that breach? Quite often people leap forward without actually considering what is the strength of this evidence. Then we contact the student. Once you've agreed that something is worth discussing with the student, obviously if it's not, you close the case, or perhaps you seek further information. The first contact is always by email, and it's always written in the person, i.e., I'm Kane, I'm such and such, I'm writing to you about. It always gives students time to respond, typically a week, 7 days. It always provides clear information about what our concerns are. It provides them clear choices. So if you agree with the concerns, this will be the outcome. If you decline to agree, we will go through a more formal process, and here is the potential range of outcomes. And as I said up before, we front load support services. So before we even talk about what the concerns are, we acknowledge that getting a letter like that might be distressing to a student, and we give wellbeing support, advocacy support, any other appropriate supports right up front. So aside from all of those, the other main purpose or the main intent of this email is to de-escalate emotion. So when you escalate emotion, big nasty headings, lots of bold, lots of confusion, big blocks of text, that effectively escalates a student's emotional response to it. So, and it also means that they're more likely to access wellbeing and advocacy. I've got zero problems if they do so, but I don't want them to do so as a result of the way that I communicated with them. So it's a thing that I've noticed, and I've checked this with our own wellbeing and advocacy services, having a lot less call for their services under this kind of approach. Some words to avoid: guilt, allegation, sanction. We use, for example, rather than allegation, we use concerns, guilt, responsibility, sanction, outcomes. Just choose more neutral synonyms for these words, but you can go through your templates tomorrow if you wish and do that same process, unless it's literally embedded in your procedure. So once a student has received their email, and while I know this whole thing is called Courageous Conversations, we should consider what's the most effective method for students to communicate with us. We want to leave the choice in their hands. So it's been my experience that different students will request different modes of communication. In the simplest matters, such as falsified medical certificates, they are virtually never answered with a request to meet. I think that's because of the evidence. Typically, we have say an email from a doctor's practice saying, I didn't see this person on that day, and any other information. It's kind of cut and dried, and students accept the validity of that, and so they don't feel the need to debate it. What we also get is really incredibly graceful emails written back to us in the vast majority of those cases. Students really, and look, I'm going to take it all at face value. I don't consider, maybe I just don't want to consider that students are just flat out kind of gilding the lily a bit when they write back to us about how they feel. They will write back to us and say, this isn't who I am. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to deal with it this way. I really appreciate it. On the other hand, there are students who ask for meetings, and the more serious the matter, the more fulsome the response will be, whether it's in writing or in person. So I would just emphasize that if you're going to hold meetings, they should not be an interrogation. You shouldn't rely on gotchas or silver bullets. Think, oh, as soon as I drop this, they'll have to admit. Some students simply won't. Students come in many forms, as we all know, and their responses come in many forms. So no matter how strong your evidence is, some students will decline the opportunity, to be honest, for their own reasons. It's important that if you hold these conversations, that you not get kind of emotionally exercised by it. Don't get annoyed that they refuse to acknowledge their position. Accept it. Accept that that's what they chose to do. The main point of a kind of literal courageous conversation, it's an opportunity for a student to provide their response to concerns that we raise in a manner and an environment that encourages them to be their best selves, even if they made a mistake. We can't make them be their best selves. The choice is up to them, but we're giving them as easy a choice as it's possible to give them in the circumstances. It's important to listen to what they're saying. When you walk into a case, believing that only this thing could have happened, and you really stop listening. So it's important to actually hear what the student has, bounce it off what you think you know and what evidence you have. And I'll give you an example. When two students are believed to have colluded, but they went to the same website, for example. That's a really simple example. So academics quite often think they talked, and they didn't necessarily. So to think about how do you frame those concerns is really important. For example, you had shared material between yourself and student A. That is a more objective description of the concerns than you colluded. So you have to be prepared to concede that your first information is not full information and does not fully capture what happened. After the process, the conversation, whether it's by email, whether it's Zoom, whether it's in person, there are really three possible outcomes. So a matter can be dismissed after the student provides further information. So in other words, they showed you something that you didn't know and it changed your view of what you had. A student can agree with the concerns raised. Then that person who held that conversation should be empowered to issue that determination. And again, remember the flat decision making. Decisions should be proportional to the severity of breaches. Most universities withhold the right to suspend and exclude for misconduct to more senior levels, and that's fine. And the other outcome is that a matter is referred to the decision-making person or body of the university for your institution. So you might have to do more investigation, maybe, but they will get to decide the outcome between what you think and what the student says. Sorry, I missed a click there. That was that slide, my bad. Penalties, outcomes in my parlance. The likely penalties must be flagged in your first contact. So you have to be very clear about what is going to happen. Should they do this or should they do that? And you've got to keep to it. So they can make a fully reasoned decision and not be kind of turned over once you decide something different. So if it's serious, they really need to know that. So if I'm raising a very serious contract cheating matter with a student, I need to be able to tell them that any subjects involved will probably get zeros. They may also be suspended, but they won't be excluded. And you can kind of specifically take certain things off the table if they agree. So we want to give students agency and choice. So we believe that they make better choices when they have more information and know what the outcomes are. Mitigating circumstances. Students often in their responses, they'll conflate what they did with why it happened, or the reasons they say it happened. You need to be able to separate these quite specifically. And you can't let the reasons why something happened change your view of whether it happened. That's a more or less objective thing. How you consider those circumstances is different. So you don't have to accept them. If a student cheated consistently over 3 years and they say, my dog died in one, well, as a dog lover and dog owner, I can certainly feel very, very sad about that. That doesn't explain the extent of the thing that happened. But you do have to give them fair consideration. So when finalizing a matter, you should write that I heard what you said, dot points, whatever, and I don't consider that it outweighs the thing that you did. So again, it's important to listen to them, but it can't overwhelm the facts of the matter. And final slide, what are the benefits of a courageous conversation, in my view? I think it's appropriate that students acknowledge mistakes. I think I've got better at it as I've got older. You don't kind of, you see the stupidity in flying into a defensive posture because you did something dumb. I want the misconduct outcomes to match the learning outcomes. So that's on the high side. So if a student cheated 6 units, 6 subjects extensively, I pretty much think that that's what the outcome should be. They should effectively get 0 for those 6 units, but I don't feel compelled to suspend and I don't feel compelled to exclude. On the low side, there are lower limits, so you can't kind of mitigate away what a student did to hold on to marks. So their dog may have died, and that would be very, very sad. But really, they failed to learn, and so the outcome should reflect that accurately. We want students to, the keenness with which universities and staff within kick out students from universities seems a very strange thing to me. I want students to remain part of our learning community. I think education it's the only industry that I'm actually really interested in working in. And I don't see why anyone else would want to kick someone out of that opportunity. Obviously, there's the kind of reduced costs, burdens, whatever you want to call that, they are significant. Retaining our view of ourselves as educators, I think when we kind of have to chisel away at our view of ourselves because of a procedure, I think that's pretty damaging. And I also like that, generally speaking, students appreciate that they were treated fairly. It kind of matches up to remaining part of our community. They didn't feel othered by our processes, and they accepted that they made a mistake, and they appreciate that we didn't damn them for it. So I'm going to kind of call it a day there, but very happy to hang around for questions. I'm sorry I went a little bit over time. Is Mathew there? There he is.
Yeah, sorry, I was just typing previously.
Oh, all good.
Discussion happening. I mean, on that last point about, not wanting to kick students out of the institution.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously there's a line, surely there's a line beyond which, it becomes beyond the pale. Somebody's essentially just buying a degree at that point.
Yep. So when a student declines to be honest, and we subsequently prove it, then I don't have any qualms about it. But they've been offered that opportunity quite explicitly up front. And people it's been called various things, like people talk about amnesties. Amnesty means nothing happens. I tend to think of it as incentivizing honesty up front. Like, to use it's an apt but slightly strange analogy. When someone commits murder and admits it before a trial, they receive a lesser penalty as a result of being honest.
Well, it's plea bargaining, isn't it?
It's plea bargaining, except we're just offering this. We're not kind of bargaining in a way. Sure. It's not a negotiation as such, but we're saying, here's what the outcome is for honesty, and it's less than that. But certainly once a student declines to be honest, we do have specific guidelines around how many, assessment subjects can be cheated, and it's a fairly low number. It's not a massively high number for exclusion, but it requires that a student is not honest in the first place.
Yeah, I guess the outlier would be that maybe a student is clever at, tell them you cried, they like it, that kind of e-portfolio scam, in the sense that, tell them you cried, they love it.
Well, I do have tissues on my desk. They won't really change my views.
Yeah, quote unquote.
There's been a lot of crying students.
Yeah. In the sense that how many times one would hope, if a student had committed a serious offence like that, contract cheating, maybe a couple of units, and they did admit it,
yep,
that they would then go on to change their ways.
That's the hope.
And then you could call that a success.
Precisely the hope.
Right? You could call that a success. Yep. But if in 6 months later, after all that, oh no, they've done it again.
You have a different problem then.
Yeah.
But it's good to have some kind of a fallback position then. So if you've already kind of, if you've already, well, obviously they get no chance if you exclude them. But if you kind of instantly kicked them out or suspended them for a year, then they came back, well, the only option you have, where I kind of go, if a student admits, I have no problem with, like, hypothetically, a student admitting an entire 3-year degree, say 24 subjects of cheating, and not suspending or excluding. They will get zeros on that. That's a massive financial cost. It's 3 years of their life they'll never get back. But I don't particularly, if they're honest about it, I don't feel compelled to suspend or exclude myself. Opinions may vary. Others may feel that they must get it. But as I said, they'll never admit if you say up front you're going to get excluded. They will fight you tooth and nail. That's
of
nailed
course.
on. That's a fact.
Yeah.
So even suspension, then they will fight that pretty hard too. But when you can say you'll get zeros, but you can re-enroll now, that's a slightly different thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
And
Deb,
essentially,
I
you've got to start
agree.
the degree again.
Shame and punish. Shame and punish. And
Yeah.
look, that would be unsurprising if they were to opt out.
Yeah. I mean, I agree there has to be a, how to call it, a sliding scale where,
Yeah,
you know,
correct. So like first, second,
educative
third.
approaches at minor things, provide as many opportunities for people to learn how to do referencing and all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely.
Because then, you know, and then you let that stuff
stuff
slide.
should be handled under an assessment procedure.
Yeah. Yeah.
That should not be anything resembling a misconduct procedure. It should be in an assessment procedure.
Yeah.
What feedback could we give? If they lose a few marks, okay, but that would be a kind of step above, right? I just don't think that any given assessment, say minor plagiarism, what precise learning outcomes were being tested in that specific part? Probably none. And Leanne, I completely agree. Like, we learn a lot about what students are doing from what they tell us about what they're doing. It's definitely an educative opportunity on our side as well. It's not just one way.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned something really early on as well about advising students of the consequences of their decisions.
Yeah.
And sure, that's when you're in the process. But you also mentioned earlier on advising students about before they even get here, if you will, in part of, I think it should be in part of the educative material, you know, academic integrity modules, etc., about the risks of engaging in the behavior to start with. Things like blackmail come to mind. I do wonder how many students are aware of those risks as well.
I think they're generally quite unaware, and universities are not good at making them aware. However, one of the things that we're working on, and we're going to implement it for S1 2024, as I said, we're able to review all of our LMS data. And so there are certainly flags that we can see happening even before a student. So, for example, we can see that a student has likely passed off their username and password to a third party before assessments have even started. So we're going to take that. I'm sure many of you would have received an SMS or a call from your bank saying, we saw some unusual activity on your account. We're going to take that approach before assessments even happen. So it really can change their sense of risk before it even gets to an assessment. We can give them a kind of, you know, your password may have been leaked. Here's where to go to update your password, that type of thing. So I think seeing that risk brought to life, it's one thing for a university to say, if you do this, we'll smack. It's another thing for the university to say, we can see it happening. We're not going to smack, but there's the risks. We're not going to smack in this instance, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, the message that sort of says, hey, your account's been compromised, potentially.
Exactly. So we're not jumping to a kind of misconduct framing. We're kind of trying to keep it in the, we want you to understand something about our capabilities sense, and also just the risk you're placing yourself at. So you could talk about you place yourself at the risk of identity theft, for example, which is entirely true of these situations. And I can guarantee that the vast majority of unis in the country have students, and not just a few, who are doing this. Providers are very actively targeting students, and once they have done a course once or a subject once for one student, very strong impulses to do it for more students.
Oh, of course, the marginal cost return equation for the business is
precisely. They get economies of scale, right?
Yeah.
And so anyone who's ever seen a kind of whistleblower email would have got a sense of that economies of scale when they're able to outsource to other countries, not just the students. The students are going through one contact. That contact is outsourcing to a legion of people in other countries. So it speaks to the size of the market.
Yeah. I mean, I guess a topic for potentially next year, your Wirraway system of, you know, how to say, sweeping the sweeping the system using the power of big data analytics, if you will, to be able to detect these patterns.
Like, I know there's objections among some for this, but in my view, by not doing it, we've opened out our students to grave risks, and we're actually, in effect, hollowing out our own institutions. There's no other way to put it. We've, as a sector, been asleep at the wheel on this stuff for a long, long time, and it's still there. It's still happening today. So we need to make a choice, because the don't look for stuff approach has failed comprehensively. 10% of students are contract cheating. That's what research says. And I have zero reason to disagree with it, except insofar as to say that it's too low. That number's not high enough. It's higher than that.
Yeah. I mean, I think some of the reasons, well, there's multiple reasons that, you know, if you were to ask my humble opinion, there's some extent of don't look, don't, it's the don't look, don't ask side of things. We don't want to courses. You know, these students, particularly, I'm not going to say internationals are worse than locals, but you know, there's significant cohorts of students in our system that basically prop it up financially. Don't scare the horses. Now, that's one aspect. The other aspect could be something along the lines of the workload of actually finding out all this stuff is horrendous.
It depends. Like, Wirru has radically improved both our ability to detect, to go through that work. So we're not just producing evidence. Wirru actually produces objective, fact-based reports, but also it allows us to take a strategic approach. So we can look at entire cohorts rather than looking for students. So we're not looking for the kind of needle in the haystack. We're actually looking at the entire thing. So we're looking at basketballs in a haystack, if you will, but they're much more visible to us. And so I think that, look, let me put the offer out there. Any university who wants to get anonymized, like, we don't want to keep your data, and we're very happy to sign NDAs and that type of thing. But any university who wants to, you could literally call your students 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 to get a picture of what's happening in units of your choice. Please feel free to send through an email request, and we will do that for you. And then we can talk about what happens after that. But we're very happy to help you get a picture of your problem.
Need to be sending you.
It would be Moodle logs. So unit-based Moodle logs. So it's under reports in the kind of tabs across the top on Moodle, reports, logs, and then just get the whole unit. So all the participants, download it as a CSV. We can do Canva logs. I understand that Blackboard's harder to get, but you can get them. And frankly, it's just a matter of us changing the headings, getting a look at the headings and see what they work out as, because we have done it for Canva and we don't use Canva. So Amy,
Canvas, yeah. Canvas LMS, yeah.
Oh, sorry. Canva is the other thing that I create slides in. Canvas, my bad.
Yes, Canvas LMS, I assume you mean.
Yeah, Canvas LMS.
What Uni Sydney
But
uses.
if you have something different, pull some logs and even just give us the headers without any information, and we'll try to work through it with you.
Cool.
So what we would do, Lucy,
you're not going to commercialize this as a software as a service online, are you?
Oh, who knows? Who knows? I have an employer. And yeah, we would have to ask their approval to, like, I don't think we would so much need their approval to do anonymized stuff, but certainly anything else we would need approval.
Sure.
But basically, we couldn't do the work we're doing without it. What will you do with the logs? So effectively what we do is analyze. First of all, what we do is enrich the data. So where it has an IP address, we use 3 different IP lookup services to determine where that IP address is, what network it's on, whether it's a VPN or some other kind of privacy service. And then we analyze patterns within that unit. And so we're able to produce a cohort analysis, and I'll go back to that image that I showed earlier. We're able to produce a network analysis between students in the unit. And this image here doesn't show any students who had no connections. So if it came out to be a white screen, that would be completely clean. We can also do individualized students. So we use this to do, once we have concerns about a student based on a risk profile, so we attribute risk points to certain activities, like, for example, access from multiple countries, just for an example. We assign risk scores, and anyone with a high risk score, we can do an individual deep dive on. That's basically what we do with logs. But at a unit level, it gives us a picture about whether there's a problem in that unit very quickly, like within 7 minutes or something.
And you can do this across multiple units, so a whole degree program?
Yes.
Or is it just, yeah, okay.
So we would tend to do them one by one, simply because we would be able to talk to that data with a unit convener. So it gives a lot of insights into what particular assessments are problematic from an integrity perspective. But we do students across program. So where we have all of their LMS data, and we will look for patterns in their entire activity set.
Okay.
Sorry, the dogs are going Burko out there.
Yeah, maybe it's their dinner time, 7 p.m.
I already ate dinner, the greedy pigs.
Okay. It is on the hour, so we can sort of officially draw the session to a close. However, if people would like to ask further questions, they're welcome to. Kane has offered to stick around for a bit longer, but I do understand people often have meetings, and given it's now 7 p.m. in Eastern Australia, people might have dinners to go to or children to put to bed. So, yeah.
Hungry buzz.
Yeah. 8 a.m.
All
after
right,
a shower.
folks, have a nice day. Thanks for coming.
Yeah. So thank you very much, folks.
Deb had an interesting question. Whose work is it's based on my work. So it's about 7 years of contract cheating investigations. That's what it's built off. We have done some conference presentations. We don't publish it in journals for the simple reason that we don't want contract cheating providers to get any help from us. Simple as that. But we're generally very happy. It's not a kind of black box. We're very happy to talk about what we base our views on.
Yep. I mean, you do have some, I believe you do have some publications on earlier work. Is that right? Not necessarily this in academic ability.
Just not on this.
Yeah.
I've got a couple of got a chapter on that. I've got a chapter on effectively helping academics to frame their evidence for contract cheating. That was with Kath Ellis and David House and Anne Rogerson from Wollongong. So when academics,
if you could send me the citations, I'll add them to the recording page. So that's the other thing, folks. In case you haven't caught that, this is recorded. It will be posted on the Transforming Assessment website, along with the slides. I hope. I assume that's okay. Kane, put the slides up.
That's fine, mate. Yep.
Yeah.
I'll just post them here. That's
Okay.
The chapter for courageous conversations.
It was worth sticking around, folks. You get to see the publication links.
There it is. Got it. There you go.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. And the second one is the advice to academics to in how to structure their evidence. Is that right?
Yep.
Yep. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. We will be back hopefully in 2024 if I can find employment, given my contract expires in March. But other than that, well, can't do anything about that. Life goes on, I suppose. If there's anybody out there who wants to give an assessment person a job, happy to hear from them. Otherwise, thank you very much. Good evening and good morning, depending where you are in the world. And
thanks, folks.
See you next year. Bye-bye.
Bye.